So good morning, everyone, and welcome, Dr. Dev Pathak, one of our resource persons, to our yet another interactive session of this two-week refresher course in social sciences and humanities. As we all are aware, that this course is being organized by the Teaching Learning Center of Ramanujan College under the aegis of Ministry of Education's Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya National Mission on Teachers and Teaching. We have today Dr. Devnath Pathak, who will be speaking or rather discussing with us on the theme Ordinary Pedagogy, Extraordinary Reflexivity. Dr. Pathak, currently a founding faculty of sociology at South Asian University, New Delhi, who previously taught at Hindu College, University of Delhi, Jamia Millia Islamia, and was also a visiting scholar at Brown International Advanced Research Institute at Brown University. He was also a Charles Wallace Fellow at Queen's University, a visiting scholar at India Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and a scholar in residence at Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. He co-edits a journal, Society and Culture in South Asia, and is on the editorial board of Journal of Human Values. Dr. Pathak's latest book, In Defense of the Ordinary, Everyday Awakenings, which presents an experiment with writing in social sciences. He also authored Living and Dying, Meanings in Maithili Folklore, that brought about the novel idea of folk imaginations of death. Besides, he edited another South Asia, Culture and Politics in South Asia, Performative Communication, Decoding Visual Word, Intersections of Art, Anthropology, and Art History in South Asia. Against Nation Thinking Like South Asian, Neighbors in Urban India, In Between Home and the World. Additionally, Dr. Pathak has authored many articles and reputed peer-reviewed journals, and occasionally also writes for popular forums such as Quint, The Scroll. So it is a privilege to have you with us, Dr. Pathak, and I request you to take over the session, and I request the participants to ask as many questions as they would like to ask from our resource person today, and he will be happy to interact with all of you.
Thank you, Shipra. It's my pleasure to talk on pedagogy with colleagues, faculty members from various places. Ideally, to talk about pedagogy, one has to, I prefer to have an interactive framework, and I tend to start by asking colleagues as to what do they have in their mind when they hear the word pedagogy. Does it ring any kind of practical interest? Does it sound like something which they have been already doing? Or pedagogy is yet another conceptual tool which may be safely located in this textbook or that reference book or in that encyclopedia, or it is something closer to us as teachers? Ideally, it is supposed to be closer to us as teachers. It is supposed to be part of our everyday life as teachers. We think in terms of pedagogy every now and then. Even this is my submission that even a bad teacher is a pedagogue in some sort of way. Why? Because good or bad teacher, evil or bad, and actually it takes us beyond good, bad, evil. Ultimately, all of us as teachers plan our lessons. Think about, in advance, we think about what we are going to teach, how we are going to conduct our classes, what are we going to do in the classes. Even if we just do delivery in lecture mode, we tend to employ certain kind of skills. We tend to also implement certain imagination about how this material should be transacted, how a particular material should be transacted in the classroom. We do selection of texts. We try to also pre-plan as to what elements of the text would be highlighted in the discussion in the classroom, how we would be inviting our students to join in certain kind of collaborative effort to make sense of a particular lesson. All these questions guide us as teachers. Informally as well as formally, we keep thinking along this line, which means we are pedagogue at the core of our vocational existence, or if you want to say professional existence, though there is difference between vocational existence and professional existence. In professional existence, we might be doing all sorts of things, including teaching and learning, primarily to fulfill professional requirements, to obtain certain kind of marks in the academic mathematics, academic calculation, to work toward promotion, to write books and publish so that we get those marks and also we get some recognition. That is typically professional existence of a pedagogue. But then I suppose no pedagogue can be at ease with merely professional existence. Eventually, it seeps into our vocation, which means it becomes part of our calling, right? And everything that we do is somehow related to that sense of calling. If it were not sense of calling, if it were just a matter of uh, earning salary or earning certain kind of utilitarian benefits, then we would have safely changed our profession. But the fact that we stay on with this profession of teaching and learning and in the business of this knowledge enterprise is precisely because somewhere this whole practice has become part of our calling, which means that even though we fulfill professional requirements, we are actually in a kind of vocation. And vocation never allows us a vacation, to put it very wittily, right? In vocation, even vacation becomes part of our efforts, our endeavors, our pedagogic endeavors, so to say. Now, this much of noble talk about the idea of pedagogy requires us to briefly reflect upon the basic tenets of this idea of pedagogy. I propose, from what I have gathered from various educationists, philosophers, sociologists who have talked about pedagogy, even historians have talked about pedagogy. From there, one can gather some of these basic tenets, and I try to simplify it by putting it into two parts. One part of pedagogy is essentially very artistic. It has strong aesthetic structure to it, which means it requires us, the teachers, to be very imaginative, very creative, also innovate once in a while in terms of the methods of teaching. We are not content with only the content of course. We also seek to figure out as to how to deliver this content in most effective and efficient manner, right? And for that matter, we go beyond ourselves as teachers and we start thinking of our students. We start thinking through them. And that is why we have series of conversation with the students. We talk to them so as we could understand as to what kind of methods would work. We talk to them and we figure out as to how we need to imaginatively and creatively transact this material, how to really forge a relational transaction between teacher and students. That part is essentially very artistic. One can also say it's a craftsman's prerogative. All the teachers, male, female, are craftsmen and craftswomen in that sense. If they are pedagogic, if they are worried about pedagogy, if they are thinking in terms of pedagogy, it means they have accepted certain kind of art and craft. They are working with that art and craft. And in that regard, I suppose some of the philosophers have helped us understand as to how teachers are essentially artists of some sort. They may not be doing visual art, they may not be doing stage performances, but teaching as performance in the classroom has been a subject of analysis amongst a lot of American educationists, Latin American, European educationists, and also in India, some of the educationists such as Krishna Kumar and others would help us understand the art of teaching, precisely because of the component of pedagogy. So that is one part of pedagogy. The second part of pedagogy is to do with our aptitude. How do we think? Intellectually, how are we oriented? How are we wired? Right? What is our way of seeing as a teacher slash scholar? How do we see things around us? How do we see classroom situation? How do we see the profile of students in the classroom? Or how do we see the location of a classroom in an institution. And furthermore, if you keep broadening this, it's an aptitude. Pedagogy is an aptitude which enables us to see our location in classroom, in institution, in a nation state, in a particular kind of geography, in the society, surrounded by all sorts of forces. It's an ability to make sense of all those forces which conditions us as teachers and students, all the forces to which we respond in some way or other. Sometimes, and somebody can say most of the times, our responses to these forces around us is in the manner of submission, surrender. We more often than not tend to surrender because we are teachers, we are not fighters in the battlefield, we surrender. Whatever diktat comes to us from anywhere, we surrender, we accept it, right? So that is where we become some sort of cog in the larger machinery of structure. Pedagogy is an aptitude which enables us to see as to how we have become cog in the larger machinery and how this cog can indulge in certain kind of struggle as well to assert oneself. So these are the two broad parts. I essentially also tend to see strong relation between pedagogy and reflexivity. This is another term which I have proposed to deliberate upon in this discussion. Reflexivity too has a long journey, largely starting in epistemology, philosophy, then coming to social sciences, and particularly in sociology and history and other social science disciplines. The term reflexivity has found lots of currency. What does it mean? It means a lot of things to a lot of people, but to simplify it further, one would say that it means ability to look at upon oneself, ability to look backward and forward, ability to see one's own position, ability to reflect over a particular situation in which one is involved. Reflexivity demands one to take an ontological turn, which means start thinking of everything that we do in terms of intellectual deliberation. Start thinking of all those things in relation with our existence, in relation with who we are, where we are located, where we come from, what are we made up of, right? So reflexivity in that sense is a good guarantee that a pedagogue, while doing pedagogy in the classroom, also outside the classroom, in university, in college premises, while talking to students in this forum or that forum, or even if no forum, maybe over a cup of tea, while doing all those things, the pedagogue is actually implementing some kind of pedagogy which involves a great deal of reflexivity, which involves this ability to forge a good relation with students, which means pedagogy, along with reflexivity, ensures that teaching and learning both would be a relational exercise. It would not merely amount to coaching a class to pass this examination or that examination. That too would be an outcome of a pedagogue's delivery, the larger process of teaching and learning. But then that is not the mere outcome that a pedagogue seeks to achieve. The outcome of this kind, utilitarian kind, in which a student, after attending a lecture, after attending a course, would be able to score in the exam in this manner or that manner. That outcome also happens, but then there is a larger outcome which guides a pedagogue, one who is informed by the idea of pedagogy. And the larger outcome is that there would be a relational enterprise of teaching and learning in which, more often than not, a teacher will also discover something new in the process of teaching and learning. Just like students are obviously discovering a lot of new things. So with this kind of, that also comes with the fact that a pedagogue is essentially a reflexive creature, right? So these are the basics I thought I should spell out before I get into uh, uh, the idea of being a pedagogue, using pedagogy in a very ordinary kind of scheme. This is necessary to be said. Why? Because More often than not, I have heard from some of the colleagues that, pedagogy is a very specialized kind of thing, which may be suitable for school teachers, but it may not be suitable for college teachers or university teachers. It's a big misnomer, right? Because pedagogy is not that specialized thing. Pedagogy is not that science which will be available only for experts who have gone through uh, rigorous training in pedagogy. No, not necessary. Pedagogy comes from practice. And as I said right in the beginning, that almost everybody who has taken to the profession of teaching and learning, to add, is some kind of pedagogue, right? So pedagogy is a generic art which is related to the practice of pedagogy. It's not necessarily related to a canon of pedagogy. There is no one holy book which can stand for this art of pedagogy. There has to be a variety of micro narratives in support of this pedagogy. On one hand, pedagogy is discussed in most of the texts as certain kind of universal enterprise, but on the other hand, it also opens up the possibility to localize this art, localize this craft, localize this in the sense that, the personal experiential narratives of scholars, teachers, learners would come into the picture. And it is there that I tend to invite teachers, students to think of pedagogy in relation with who they are, where they are located, what they are doing, and how do they intend to carry it forward. Pandemic, because we are discussing this in the when the pandemic is ongoing. Pandemic was a time when we realized the necessity of revisiting pedagogy far more strongly than ever before, and we realized it with this clear idea that, if we have to switch to online mode of education, we probably need to strengthen pedagogy more than ever before. Why? Because in online mode of education, it's very much possible that both teachers and students would get disillusioned sooner or later. If it were for strong pedagogic imagination on the part of teachers, strong, consistent pedagogic endeavors which would keep both students and teachers synergized. Only by doing that, one can probably make online mode of teaching and learning a vibrant experience. And that is where I tend to contextualize today's discussion on pedagogy by suggesting that as teachers, most of us during in the last 2 years might have felt the necessity of reinventing our craft. And it is in that regard, it is with that concern of reinventing our craft, it becomes necessary to return to the idea of pedagogy. Of course, with due sensitivity to the context in which we are talking. And when we talk of pedagogy in today's time, we are reminded of some of the lessons that we learned from some of the philosophers. Let me share with you a text that I recently did for a journal, and that text might be slightly helpful in understanding as to what it means when I say doing pedagogy with due context sensitivity. If we take a teacher to be an artist, which we have done right at the onset of today's discussion, if we take a teacher to be an artist, perhaps it becomes a compulsive necessity to draw an equivalent between teachers and tragedies. Following the Maverick existential philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, just like an embodied experience of tragedy triggers immense existential aesthetic energy in an artist, we could expect the teachers to let their practices be inspired, instigated, and invigorated in the time of pandemic. Is it too much of wishful thinking? Are we expecting too much from the salaried professionals called the teachers? After all, in the regime of old normal before pandemic, when classes were conducted in real spaces and all the practices had very well structured tangibility, teachers only enacted the prescribed roles. Not really like automatons in a Kafkaesque thriller. Franz Kafka's thriller has human characters almost enacting the behavior of an automaton. Unlike them, the teachers, even in the old normal, happen to be minds at work, following a preordained recipe, formulas, and the book of bylaws. If they had too much of agony, too much of pain, they wrote op-ed articles or gossiped with trusted colleagues in the corners of staff room, or simply resorted to consulting a psychiatrist if they fell really ill. Translating tragedies into a teaching force required the teachers to creatively take pedagogy, which they found too taxing a job perhaps. And hence, mostly they all subscribed to teach to fulfill the official job, research, write, publish for professional advancement, and that is celebrated as a job well done. However, we need to depart from this kind of status quo. When we try to depart from this kind of status quo, we are actually allowing the pedagogy as an art, as a craft, and as an aptitude to come back to us with full force. Specifically in the precincts of higher education, pedagogic concerns were left out for only a few of the teachers who perpetually worried about the question how to teach. Exceptional teachers also pondered upon another fundamental idea, how to teach or how to be a teacher. And accordingly, they deemed it necessary to rethink what and why to teach. Such educationists' deliberations dealt with the tragedies of the pedagogues. For the larger varieties of teachers, however, tragedies, if any, were deemed only as sporadic problems of the excessively sensitive types of teachers. Some of the senior peers, therefore, invariably advised the newly joined young lecturers and professors, saying, don't worry about teaching, it is not to supersede your scholarship. Teachers conform to the established norms, and thereby pedagogy seldom enters their prized purview. Scholarship, research writing, publication, more often than not, were preponderant over teaching, pedagogy, and pedagogues' freewheeling collaboration with the students in the teaching learning practices. One can say there was little normal in the so-called old regime of normalcy before the advent of the pandemic-driven singularity of the online education. Anybody could recall the lessons we learned from someone like Michel Foucault about the ways of disciplining in the process of education, ways of controlling of mind and body, morally ascertained technical management, reaffirmed power of the most powerful, perpetual docility, docile-bodied teacher and taught, and the hegemony of what Foucault called crypto-educationalists. Those crypto-educationalists actually rule the institutions of education. Many teachers, many of us teach Foucauldian critique of the systems, and yet we never allow this critique to enlighten the teaching learning practices. It is in this context, which multiplied intellectual, emotional, and institutional tragedies of the teachers along with the taught in recent times, we need to return to the idea of teacher with pedagogic imagination, aspiration, and will to enact a relational mode of teaching practice with their students. And that is how the teachers will remain an efficient, veritable artist dealing with Nietzschean tragedies that I mentioned in the beginning. The art of being a teacher, which pedagogy essentially is about. The art of being a teacher during the pandemic, before the pandemic, and even afterwards would require us to be phenomenologically attuned, reflexive enough to take a stock of our academic practices independent of the structures in which we are located. A strong orthodoxy about teaching social sciences has been dominant across South Asia for a very long time. It has degenerated into a variety of, institutional monoliths. One can also say there is a kind of academic Brahmanism which dominates this institutional monoliths. If one reflects on the practice of teaching in this kind of time, one realizes that, the structural monoliths, institutions with hierarchy, strong hierarchy in place, they create a very unique kind of liminality, unique kind of spaces here and there where a pedagogue can independently execute his or her art and craft, his or her aptitude that enables them, the pedagogues, to take note of the situation and accordingly strategize, accordingly plan. This I am saying not just to romanticize the idea of pedagogy or romanticize the idea of reflexivity. I am saying this in spite of my uh, well-reasoned understanding of the structural problems with education. A lot of scholars have helped us understand as to how not only school system, also in higher education institutions, universities, we have great deal of structural constraints put upon teachers and pedagogues and students. And in that kind of situation, it seems almost difficult, impossible to imagine that there could be a space for pedagogy left. But then a lot of scholars have also talked about pedagogue as mavericks. Pedagogue as mavericks. What do mavericks do? I recall one educationist, a historian educationist, Rajan Gurukul, based in Kerala. He gave us this idea recently in one of his journal pieces about maverick professors. And he said that in his article, he said that that a maverick professor, and I extend it to maverick pedagogues, can dismiss the, I'm quoting him, dismiss the stale routine of imposing syllabus-driven lessons upon their students and concentrate on the task of teaching how to learn, stimulating curiosity, promoting higher cognitive levels, and rendering emotional support. This is what is expected of the maverick pedagogues who are ready to employ pedagogy as an art, craft, and aptitude. They are supposed to not just carry out a given syllabus, carry out the task of teaching in most mechanical fashion, or carry out evaluation and elimination of students. They are also supposed to be doing great deal of stimulating of curiosity. They are also supposed to promote higher cognitive levels, and through relational enterprise of teaching and learning, they are supposed to generate emotional support. This is pertinent ideal to work towards while taking notes of what tragedies would unfold alongside. We understand that structurally, system of education is mostly about taming the shrew, if I can borrow the idea from Shakespeare's drama. It's also about, metaphorically about breaking horses so as the horses allow the saddle, the riddle, and the rider upon themselves. Mavericks among teachers and students are structurally the shrew to be tamed, the horses to be broken, and the minds and anatomical entities to be disciplined into docile bodies of Michel Foucault, the docile bodies which Michel Foucault talked about. It is in such kind of backdrop that we need to return to the idea of an ordinary pedagogy in the time of pandemic. One also says all over the world, people have been also talking about pandemic pedagogy, which is very ordinary kind of, which is basically about recalling the forgotten ordinariness which comes from the practically executed pedagogy. Uh, because these things are very ordinary. All the ideals that I have mentioned with reference to Rajan Gurukul, the historian educationist, are very ordinary attributes of humankind, isn't it? like rendering emotional support, generating curiosity. These are supposed to be done by any means, by any teacher, by anybody who is in relation with one another. But then what happens is that in the time of pandemic, particularly, we saw that in addition to the structural order, the institutional order which governed us, there also came into picture a technological order. Many Latin American, some of the Latin American and European educationists have criticized this technological order which came into picture with the advent of online mode of education. And they have criticized technological order precisely by employing pedagogy as an aptitude, which I discussed right in the beginning. And likewise, I suppose the colleagues who I am addressing through this discussion, they are also invited to think along this line as to how pedagogy as an aptitude can enable them to make sense of their situation, make sense of all kind of knee jerks, ad hoc measures, and upside down thrusting of instruction that resulted into techno managerial kind of quick fix solution to the pandemic based online education mode. By taking note of the situation, probably teachers today will have the ability to perpetuate the idea of pedagogy, which I discussed in the beginning, and also continue to perform and figure out the ways of performing it. This certainly also would involve certain kind of uncertainty, because students also come up with their expectations. Their expectations might be that teachers will just speak in the microphone, they would be absent from the screen, or they would just log in and be absent from the screen, and that's the class done. They have also discovered all kind of digital version of kunjis, guidebooks, which would help them far better in writing ready-made answers to some of the questions we ask in the examination. By the way, once one has started implementing pedagogy as an art and craft and aptitude, one would also, as a teacher, rethink the kind of questions we frame in the examination. We would not be asking questions about, how to define this term or define that term, how to explain this term. We would not be asking a question which will be answered simply by this or that kunji book. Instead, our questions would be related to the everyday situation of teachers and students, of the context in which one is located. And in that, coming together of text and context, the prescribed texts from which students will learn and the context in which a student is learning, both of them would be brought together only if teachers begin to ask very different kind of innovative questions. Moreover, this whole process is also rife with uncertainty, in the sense that students may or may not take you as seriously as they did in the face-to-face communication when you had in the classroom. These are some of the limitations which one would come across while practicing as a pedagogue. There would be situations of utter frustrations too. Just like students get frustrated, teachers too have their rights to get frustrated. But then what to do? I remember Paulo Freire, one of the great educationists of our time, who would, on one hand, give us a classical work such as Pedagogy of Oppressed. On the other hand, he would also give us Pedagogy of Hope. And in between Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Pedagogy of Hope, we, the pedagogues of today, have to find a way in the relationship between teachers and students, and not a way out. So with that kind of remark, I would stop by recalling that there would be limitations, there would be moments of frustration, but a pedagogue is a die-hard optimist, a creature who would return again and again to the art and craft of teaching, would always rethink the ways in which a course content should be transacted, would always rethink the way in which a question should be framed, inviting a student's imaginative, creative ability to connect the text and the context. In that regard, one can say that pedagogy also allows the teacher and a student to start playing with the things rather than be a disciplined and disabled kind of creatures who would not have freedom, intellectual freedom to play with the materials which they learn in the classroom. That's where I will stop. If you have any questions, I would be pleased to answer.
Yes, right now, yes. So you were asking something, or what? Did I miss this?
I said
Yeah.
that's where I will stop. Instead of making it too much of monologue,
Yeah.
it's better to take up if there is any questions.
As of now, if you want to focus something more on thought, because abhi to, as of now, there are no
How much
questions.
how
Yeah.
much more time do I have?
You can speak for another 15 minutes, 15, 20
All
minutes.
right.
Yes.
So one particular aspect which I mentioned quickly, but I did not elaborate
Mhm.
upon, was the idea of a unique kind of liminality that exists between a pedagogue and the structure in which a pedagogue would be located. What does it mean? I will take up this opportunity to now elaborate a little bit on that. This basically means that a lot of critique of education have helped us understand that the problem is primarily with the structure, or the power regime of power which governs the structure. uh, we have been able to point our fingers to some of the villains who stop us from being free floating pedagogues. Free floating in the sense that we can have intellectual freedom to imagine differently, to shape up a course differently, or to conduct examination in a mode which will be more humanized kind of examination. It would not be an intimidating examination. So we have been able to recognize some of these villains. We have always pinpointed one or other kind of vice chancellor, one or other kind of principal, one or other kind of head of department, or we go to the extent of um, villainizing. And it's not wrong. One understands that these are the forces which curtails a pedagogue's freedom, and therefore probably rightly we have gone to villainize market forces as well, the industry, the employment market. And we go to the extent of suggesting that the kind of ideological regime which comes to power and which starts to govern us, those ideological forces are also responsible for the decline of pedagogic practices, so and so forth. We also say that structural constraints in an institution play a role in the decline of the pedagogic practices. Most of the teachers have probably forgotten about the pedagogic responsibility precisely because they have ceded their space to the professional requirements. So it's merely fulfillment of the task that one has to do. And for other kind of purposes, one has to find a way out of these kind of structures in which one is located, so and so forth. That is one way of thinking. That thinking is also enabled by the pedagogic perspective. As I told you, the aptitude of pedagogue would enable one to take note of the problems, the constraints, the limitations, the anomalies, structural anomalies. But then on the other hand, we tend to think that a pedagogue is a pure individual, which is this binary opposition between structure and agency, the collective and the individual. This binary opposition probably curtails our possibility of understanding pedagogy in the manner in which I have tried to explain. Um, we need to see that a pedagogue, a teacher, uh, of a kind who believes in vocational existence, or of the kind who believes in professional existence, any kind of teacher is a relational entity. It's an entity which is in relation with the structure. It's not binary opposition of the structure. We are teaching a particular course to a particular group of students precisely by the virtue of our location within an institution, within a structure. So one cannot deny the importance of that institution, that structure. That is not the point here. Point is a little more than that, which means to show that our pedagogic practices will be more nuanced if we keep in our mind that we are related to the structure which we may criticize as a pedagogue, right? We are related in the sense that we are taking benefits from that structure. We are enabled by that structure. Even though we know that we are paying a price for this enabling, we are paying a price in terms of the kind of freedom that we expect. But then that is not the end of the story. That kind of criticism of structure, of the power to be, of market forces, of variety of conditioning forces is fair enough. But on the other hand, one also has to see that because of the kind of craft that is involved in pedagogy, there is always a space in between individual and collective. There is always some kind of space in between institution, structure, and individual pedagogues, right? And if one is really able to employ pedagogy as art, craft, aptitude, one would be able to see that space in between. That space in between I am calling unique liminality. In that space, liminality was an idea which came from some of the anthropologists who were trying to study rites and rituals. And they said that during the ritual performances, an individual who is going through the ritual performance is sandwiched between the pre-given structure and something which is going to happen afterwards, right? And in that space in between, the individual is free, is creatively free to do a lot of other things, right? Or to do nothing. So that kind of creative, unique space in between structure and individual is what I am eyeing at as a pedagogue's space, as a space where student and teacher can do a lot of experimentation with ideas, will have freedom to do that experimentation, and would also have freedom to come across the follies of experimentation, the failure of experimentation. So when one is, that's why I said that there would be a moment of utter frustration for both students and teachers, because theoretically pedagogy entails those moments of frustration. It allows you, it helps you to recognize where the experiment with ideas can fail, right? It allows you to see as to how certain kind of experimentation are merely individuals' temporary fancies, and some other kind of experimentation may have long-lasting results. These abilities would come from a pedagogue, a student, and a teacher who is driven by the idea of pedagogy and who is able to locate oneself in this in-betweenness, right? In-betweenness is not always a bad thing. Unfortunately, a lot of poets might have, in the religious civilization, we have learned about the benefit of in-betweenness, right? Buddhist epistemology highlights this notion of in-betweenness great deal. Even in Hindu religious civilizational texts, we have discussions on the idea of in-betweenness. One has to also realize that in day-to-day life, in practical life, we are not governed by polarity. Our mind is not equal to so-called WhatsApp university. We are not governed by polarity of ideas. Instead, we are governed by the practical day-to-day ideas, the practical day-to-day concern. And that is where in-betweenness starts giving you great deal of space to think differently, to plan differently, to frame a question differently. For example, one may always ask a direct question. What is a community? From a social science student, or from a sociology student, from a civics student? What is citizenship? This kind of straight questions is one kind of question. We have been habitual of asking these kind of questions. The other kind of question could be, How do you think you are a citizen? With reference to your own particular experiences, define citizenship. Now, this requires a student, and this kind of question can be asked only if you have recognized the space in between, right? If you know that you are a pedagogue in between the individual fancies of yours and the structural constraints within which you're located, in that in-betweenness, you will be experimenting with your questions as a teacher, or you would be likewise experimenting with the content that you're going to teach in the classroom. In that kind of space in between, with this kind of pedagogic imagination, a teacher will find it extremely difficult to reduce one book into 5 points, 5 bullet points, right? It would be very difficult to carry out this kind of pedagogy by using PowerPoint slides, right? Those PowerPoint slides may make your practical life easy, your students' practical life easy, but then that can be an enemy of pedagogic imagination. That can be an enemy of the pedagogic practices as well, right? Enemy in the sense that it will shrink the kind of pedagogic possibility that exists in the hand of a student and a teacher. That's where I suppose this idea of unique liminality comes into picture. Unique liminality in which pedagogic practices will flourish has to be in the first place recognized by the pedagogues, and in the second place every pedagogue has to understand as to how to employ the art and craft of pedagogy in this unique liminality. In this unique liminality, you may have also another kind of frustration. Everybody, it's very easy to talk about freedom, intellectual freedom, academic freedom, freedom to teach in one manner, freedom to learn in one manner. But when freedom comes, everybody does not take it very lightly, very easily. It's not so easy to handle freedom, right? In freedom, I have seen, while practicing some of these things in my own classroom, I have seen how students go berserk with the kind of freedom that is offered. During the pandemic, I asked students right in the beginning of a course that I was teaching. The course is a discussion on philosophies of social sciences. In the very beginning, I asked students to do a kind of collaborative exercise between me as a course teacher and them as students. Do a collaborative exercise of reshaping, restructuring the whole course so that it could be executed in the online mode without any kind of uh, negative repercussions, right? Uh, I gave them freedom, the freedom was made available. Who am I to give freedom? Freedom was made available or pointed out or flagged for their convenience to understand that this possibility exists with students to reshape a course along with a teacher, in discussion with the teacher. And mind it, it was not so easy for students. They find it easier to be given a course rather than reshaping the course and taking control of their destiny as learners. Likewise, it's very easy to talk about open book exams, but when students have to give open book exams, they find great deal of difficulty in handling that temptation of copying from all sorts of sources, right? This copy paste from all sorts of sources, and they think that only by copying and pasting and a good answer could be made. So freedom is not always easy to handle. In this kind of space in between, when we are driven by pedagogy, we also learn how to handle freedom, how to utilize freedom, what to really do with freedom, right? So there are moments of frustration. There are moments of recognition that yes, this is here, but this is only so much one can do. One also realizes, as a teacher, I have always realized that the pedagogic practices might bring about very small kind of results, and that may be slightly disappointing for somebody who is seeking for something very big, something spectacular, some spectacular kind of change in aptitude, in the craftsmanship, in the ways in which students and teachers teach and learn. That may not be the moment of frustration, particularly in my view, because pedagogy is primarily to seek out smaller changes, and those smaller changes will go in the long run, would play a very significant role in the mind and life of students and teachers both in long run. I am always guided by E.F. Schumacher's that book, which was titled Small is Beautiful, and the ideas in that book. I suppose a pedagogue's dream project is for these kind of small changes which can happen in the way we do things. That's where I will stop.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Pathak. And we do have a couple of questions or, people who would like your opinion on certain things. So one of the questions which a participant is asking, Mr. Karan, he's asking, how can we see the role and power of students as consumers of knowledge with respect to pedagogy in the current Indian context? Second, I'll just take three at a time. Second is education. Shahul Hamid is asking, is educational pedagogy the same as school pedagogy? And the last question for this one set is Mr. Kulandai is asking, extraordinary pedagogy seems to be more of summative than of formative nature. If you would like to comment on this.
Say the last one again.
Extraordinary pedagogy seems to be more of summative than formative.
So what is the name who has asked this?
Mr. Kulandai.
Mr. Kulambai.
Dai, D-A-I.
Okay. Thank you. Interesting questions, provocative questions. I mean, this, I can go on for another 1 hour talking about some of these things. To begin with, Karan, I suppose right in the beginning, when we are thinking of ourselves as consumers of knowledge, we need to recognize one thing. Why do we say consumer of knowledge today? Did we always say consumer of knowledge? If we look at history of ideas, we didn't say consumer of knowledge in posterity. We didn't call ourselves consumer of knowledge in posterity. The Greek philosophers were not consumers of knowledge. The Mimamsa scholars in India were not consumers of knowledge. Those who read the Mahabharata were not consumers of knowledge. Or even today, those who read the Quran with a great deal of devotion are not consumers of knowledge in the Quran, knowledge that they get from the Quran. Why do we say consumer of knowledge today? It's precisely because of this larger, something which I was referring to, the larger structural situation around us, which some of the political economists call neoliberal capitalist structure around us, in which our institutions are located, we are also located. And therefore, the market wants us, the state wants us, all kind of forces around us want us to be consumers. We are no longer producer citizens, we are consumer citizens, so to say, right? That is a new turn in political studies. Now we have to start recognizing ourselves as consumer citizens. We are voters, strongly consumer voters, right? We vote because we consume. One can go to the extent of exaggerating all these kind of exaggerated formulations are nice provocation for fresh thinking. I would suggest that, first of all, one has to, as a pedagogue, one has to recognize why we call ourselves consumers of knowledge. Can we be consumers of knowledge? We can be consumers of information. We can consume information coming from all sorts of, all parts of the Google. I mean, Google is the best engine, so to say, or consumers of memes circulating on social media. We can be consumers of those items. Can knowledge be an item too? Can knowledge be reduced into an item? My whole discussion is precisely that if we are guided by pedagogic goals, we cannot reduce knowledge into items. My last part of my discussion is precisely suggesting that the reduction of course content into 5 bullet points or 10 bullet points on PowerPoint slides is a great disservice to the idea of pedagogy. It's a decline, that shows the decline of pedagogic practices. It's not to suggest that all those who use PowerPoint slides will not have any pedagogic concerns. but one has to evaluate that pedagogic concerns. One has to be reflexive enough to recognize the pedagogic concerns, the pedagogic value of that approach in which we try to put on PowerPoint slides 5 points or 10 points, which students will learn and crack UPSC exam or UGC exam or even college examination, so on and so forth. Right? I am suggesting, I'm provoking, Karan, ourselves to ask whether this is decline or incline of our pedagogic practices, which reduce a learner or teacher into consumer of knowledge, which reduce the course content into these many points on PowerPoint slides. Right? So my whole, when I am talking about pedagogy, I'm basically suggesting that one has to be mindful, one has to be apprehensive about this whole process of reduction, right? When we employ pedagogy as an aptitude to take note of the anomalies around us, we also take note of this particular anomaly, right? Which is expressed with the usage of the word consumer. There is nothing against consumers. We are all consumers. I love to consume all sorts of things. I'm sure you also like to consume, Karan, good ice cream, good chocolate. And if you are into drinking, good quality of scotch, good brand of beer. We are all consumers. We consume all sorts of things on OTT, on Netflix, on Amazon. We are all consumers, no doubt. But consumers of knowledge, particularly in reference to the discussion on pedagogy, is a little bit of, misfit. If we are really talking about pedagogy, we will recognize as to how a learner or a teacher is brought down to the level of consumption of knowledge. And that's also fake. The moment you say consumption, it cannot be of knowledge, because knowledge is a little more than information. And information can be a bulletin item. Knowledge cannot be a bulletin item. Therefore, when you read a scholar, you know for sure that this scholar is not just a journalistic reporter. A journalistic reporter will just report an event. A scholar will get into the business of churning it, right? Just like there was Sagar Manthan, a scholar would make lots of, host of information into knowledge by doing great deal of churning, by doing great deal of analysis, by applying variety of insights, concepts, theories, by getting guided by philosophical debates. And that is how information, host of information, would go through a process to become a knowledge. Bits and pieces of information can be consumed. Knowledge cannot be consumed. Knowledge has to be meditated upon. Meditation is not consumption. Unfortunately, it has been made into consumption by some of the god men. So Karan, I would say that, when we try to employ pedagogy as a teacher, we are not only concerned about the classroom business, we are also concerned about outside classroom, the way we think, right? So that would be my long repartee on your question, Karan. Coming to Hamid's question. Very important question, Hamid. Unfortunately, a lot of us who do higher education, who are located in universities, and we are also scholars, researchers, we write, we read, we design our courses, we teach, we do a lot of things. And we also nurse, Hamid, we also nurse this misunderstanding that pedagogy is supposed to be primarily a school teacher's headache, right? Pedagogy is not headache of those teachers who are primarily known as scholars, who are located in universities and colleges. That's a misnomer. Anybody who is teaching is a pedagogue. Anybody who is teaching anywhere, even in private institutions, even in coaching institutions, if somebody is teaching, somebody has to deal with pedagogy. Even if one is not conscious of it, I told you right in the beginning, even if one is not conscious of it, one knows for sure that one is going through a pedagogic process. It's another thing that if you evaluate that pedagogic process, you can say that this pedagogic process is not great enough. It is very narrow pedagogic process, so on and so forth. That is all your evaluative concern. But pedagogy is very much present in some way or other, in some form or other, good, bad, evil, in whatever, with whatever adjectives you want to characterize it. But pedagogy would be always there. When it comes to distinguishing the school pedagogy and the pedagogy in colleges and universities, once again, I would suggest that, this distinction is more egoistic and arrogant distinction than it should be. Why? Because pedagogy is pedagogy. Craftsmanship, art in school and colleges, how will you distinguish? It's just like saying that a craftsman working on the brass in Moradabad is inferior to an installation artist who is making an installation art for exhibition in a gallery in New York. That separation, the old separation of craftsman and art, visual art, contemporary visual art, modern art. We saw the problem in that separation. Likewise, I suggest that there is a problem in this separation between pedagogy in school education and pedagogy in higher education. I suggest let's not operate with this kind of separation. It's an unholy separation. It's like suggesting that wife works, my wife is a housewife who works at home, and therefore her work is a different kind of work, and that work will be evaluated differently, and I work outside and therefore my work should be evaluated differently. I am a homemaker and therefore the value of my work should be superior to my housewife's work, who is just a homemaker, and therefore she sits at home and therefore her work would be evaluated with the lower denominators and all. No, that separation is dangerous for my mind. So I would suggest that one has to see the relation of pedagogy, be it at school level or at the level of higher education. Hamid, I hope I tried answering your question too. Kalandai, I am, last question, Kalandai, if I am pronouncing your name correctly, I hope. If we were interactive, I would have corrected myself by asking you for the correct pronunciation of your name. But my whole point in this whole 45 minutes or 50 minutes presentation, the discussion, was to suggest that it is not extraordinary pedagogy. Pedagogy is not supposed to be extraordinary. The moment it becomes extraordinary, it will become another canon. And it would expect you to go on a crusade. That's very dangerous. The moment it becomes extraordinary, there will be some experts. There are already experts who say that, I am expert of pedagogy. Pedagogy is a matter of practice, and it is available with all the teachers. I remember there was one cultural theorist, George Herbert Reed, who, I'm sure it was not his original idea, he took it from some classical text. He said, he was of the view that everybody is an artist. It's a different thing that every artist is of different kind of individual. Every individual is an artist. It's another thing that every artist will be a different kind of individual. Likewise, every teacher, anybody who is in the business of teaching and learning is a pedagogue. It's another thing that this pedagogy of the pedagogue will be of different kind. So the reason why I try to trivialize, at one level I'm trying to make it trivial, make it sound like everyday thing, ordinary thing. It's when I am talking to you, I have certain kind of pedagogy that I have employed. Given this online mode in which we are not interactive, I'm sure my pedagogy is slightly constrained, but then I'm trying to generate certain kind of dialogue with you. This whole aptitude, this whole inclination of mine to be in dialogue with you shows my pedagogic interest, and it's very ordinary. There is no extra effort involved in it. This is supposed to be very ordinary human attribute, isn't it? Getting into dialogue. Paulo Freire, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, highlighted the idea of dialogue, and he said that the oppressed needs a pedagogy in which love will be central emotion and dialogue will be central practice. Now, both love and dialogue, do you think these are very extraordinary, exclusive kind of thing? No, we all love and we all get into dialogue, right? So my whole purpose is to go against this notion of extraordinary, related to pedagogy. No, pedagogy has to be presented as something very ordinary, very everyday thing, and therefore very reflexive, very much related to our practices, and therefore available to all of us.
Yes. That was quite an intervention. So the last two questions, which are interlinked, and these are the last questions of the session as well. Miss Jayashree is asking from Central University of Gujarat that how to deal with the structural constraints. Can revised courses, innovative teaching, and some non-conventional evaluations help us, and how to go about it? And related to this only, Mr. Balaji, uh, he is asking if you would like to suggest some strategies to inculcate high curiosity among students to motivate them for in-depth self-learning practices. Yeah.
Thank you, Jayashree, Balaji. And thank you, Shipra, for being our bridge between
Happy to
me
do
and
that.
some of these colleagues who are asking very interesting questions. Very beautiful question, Jayashree. I have personally dealt with this not only in terms of writing, also in terms of practice. I mean, writing because it is related to practice. I always write whatever is related to my practice. So, and a lot of my friends, my colleagues in universities tend to think that, you know, that is largely structural problem. It has nothing to do with the teacher, individuals. It's largely structural constraint, and that constraint cannot be handled merely by a pedagogue's imagination, creativity, and all sorts of experiments that a pedagogue would like to do. However, I have tried to pinpoint that there is, nobody would disagree with the fact that structural constraints are paramount. They're very big things. But we also know that we cannot, we have been hearing slogans for last how many years? I mean, you read the history and you will figure out for so many years, so many decades, we have been hearing the slogans about against capitalism. But then we know that capitalism graduated and became neoliberal capitalism. And then we are not very sure whether one can really uproot any of these kind of things. So let some of those people theorize this situation and also give us new slogans. That is one kind of thing some people are doing. I have no intervention on that front. But then as an individual teacher, I cannot just sit back and helplessly wait for the Godot to come or some kind of charisma to happen, some kind of miracle to happen from somewhere that will allow me to do or allow my students to do what they want to do. No, I will not wait for that. Instead, I will be a teacher. And that's why I refer to Freire's Pedagogy of Hope, a wonderful book. And that hope comes from the simple fact that I am a teacher. And there are some students, out of 50 students in one class, out of 50 students, at least there would be 5 who would listen to me and who would work with me, who would get into serious relation with me as far as learning and teaching is concerned, right? So if we have recognized that possibility with a pedagogue, with the pedagogy, then Jayashree, you are right. We will start playing with the given formats, the given forms. We will start tweaking the forms. As you have rightly suggested, some kind of unconventional measures will be taken up, not only in teaching, also in the way we conduct evaluation. A different kind of questions will be asked. And not only questions will be asked, also all other sorts of things will be subject to evaluation. Mind, the moment we, Jayashree, the moment we say evaluation, we tend to intimidate our students. Can't we say something else? I mean, somebody was saying that, everything we talk about in terms of pedagogic freedom requires us to have a system without examination. No, there can be examination, but there can be a system of examination which is not at all intimidating, which is not at all threatening. which is not at all telling the students that we are the bosses and in our hand we have this weapon of examination which we will use to promote some of you and to decimate some of you. That kind of, if we just remove that threat from the system of examination, probably examination will become yet another opportunity for us to be a pedagogue and for them to be a student, to be a learner. Even through examination, even by giving examination of a certain kind without any threat, we might be enabling our students to learn a great deal about life, about what they have to go through, what they have gone through. There would not be any need of any kind of psychiatrist or psychoanalyst if we have a proper system of examination in place, right? A psychiatrist would ask a question and the patient will answer those questions, and that is the whole therapy. If that can be therapy, why can't a properly imagined system of examination could be therapeutic for all of us, can be liberating for all of us from all sorts of repressed experiences. I totally agree with you, Jayashree, that with this kind of reflexive pedagogy of very ordinary nature, one has to think of many unconventional ways of doing things, including the exams. Balaji, I suggest you talk to Jayashree, and I suppose Jayashree has quite a few strategies already on hand, which I have just responded to. And some of those, if you want to call them strategies, right? Now, it also depends what do we call a strategy. I suggest that, it may not be a strategy. Pedagogy is never a strategy. As I told you, pedagogy is an art. When you go and talk to any craftsman in your neighborhood, any craftsman, a cobbler, or a man who repairs my bicycle, or somebody, a mechanic, all of them are craftsmen, right? If you talk to, or somebody at home who does sewing on a sewing machine, or just hemming with a needle, or putting a thread in the buttons, right? If you talk to them, you ask them, do they follow a strategy? Do they strategize? Do they come up with a strategy before they start performing their craft? They don't. There is no need of strategy. Strategy is between the warring parties. Strategy is required between the warring parties. There is need of strategy between Taliban and the non-Talibani Afghan authority. That is where strategy is required. We are not on a war. Between teacher and student, there is no war. There cannot be a war. If there is war, then we are not teachers and students. And therefore, there is no need of strategies. What is needed here is pedagogy. And I just like the first question, which was about consumption of knowledge. Likewise, I will suggest that let's not think of pedagogy as a strategy. Our techno-managerial administrators in the colleges, in the schools, in the higher education institutions, they might think of pedagogy as strategies. But for pedagogues, those are not strategies. For an artist, the way artwork happens, art practices, those are not strategies. Those are doing, right? And doing with great deal of trial and error. This openness, and that is why I connected pedagogy with reflexivity, because that gives you openness to recognize that whatever you are doing might fail, that you are open to the idea of going through trial and error. And therefore, when you strategize, you try to minimize the possibility of error. You try to weed out the possibility of failure. As a pedagogue, we are not worried about the weeding out part, right? A lot of my colleagues will say that you will land in trouble if you do not weed out all those risks involved. If there is no risk, trust me, there is no pedagogy. If there is no risk, there cannot be any art. That's where I will stop, Balaji. I suppose my answers are not too harsh. Your questions are interesting enough to provoke further investigation in my mind, and therefore I'm taking that tangent. But the point is that, you're right, Balaji, in that regard, that one has to come up with the ideas and ways to materialize the kind of pedagogy that we have discussed. Materialize means to be a pedagogue, just like that. If it's just about being the pedagogue, and therefore allowing the ordinary skills of a pedagogue to come into picture, to come to play a role in teaching and learning programs.
True. I think that's true. And if I may say, there are two memories which came to my mind after listening to a lecture. One was a very dear memory of my literature teacher in school who taught us, she discussed Merchant of Venice, the famous play, and that very famous, speech on mercy. And that speech still is imbibed in my mind just because the way she, shared that whole in the feelings, emotions with us. And another, when you were discussing Paul Freire, I couldn't stop myself from thinking about bell hooks and her book about teaching community, Pedagogy of Hope, and the whole idea of education as a practice of freedom. So yes, it is, I'm quite sure the participants will agree with me, and they are, you can see in YouTube, they are constantly messaging that it has been a very informative session and a very fruitful one. So thank you so much. On this note, I would really, I'm humbled and I'm very grateful to you to, agree on a very short span of time to, have spent time with us this morning and share your thoughts, your reflections on a very important topic, which is quite very dear to my heart as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Pathak, for being with us.
Thank you, Shipra. Thank you, Shipra. Thank you, everyone who was attending the lecture. I had pleasure talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.